So, people, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ana Lúcia Araújo. This is the Slaveryarchive Book Club, and I am one of the hosts. And Alex Gill from Yale University, who is just here with me, is my co-host. So today we are here to discuss. Then this is our second session this semester, and we are here then to discuss the new book by James H. Sweet. And then let me just put it here. Then the title of the book is Mutiny on the Black Prince, Slavery, Piracy, and the Limits of Liberty in the Revolutionary Atlantic Road. And this is a book that was just published this January with Oxford University Press. So before we start, I just want to say a few words that many of you, perhaps you already know, Jim, but I will introduce you because this is what is going to be also recorded and available online. So James H. Sweet is the Vilas-Jartz Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research interests range widely across the history of Africa and the African diaspora. In January 2023, he completed his term as the president of the American Historical Association, which is the largest organization of its kind in the world, and the oldest organization of historians in the United States as well. He is the author of two prize-winning books that many of you, perhaps you know, and of course that many of you used these books in your classes and assigned them. Recreating Africa, Culture, Kinship, and Religion in the African-Portuguese World, 1441-1770, that this is a book of 2003. Also, the award-winning book, Domingos Álvares, African Healing and the Intellectual History of the Atlantic Road, that is a book of 2011, and that won the Frederick Douglass Prize of the Gilder Lehrman Center. And his third book, that is the third single author book that you are going to discuss today, which was just published with Oxford University Press. So welcome, and I leave now the floor to Jim. Alex is here as well. You'll be moderating the chat, and after the presentation, we are going to have time for Q&A and to continue this conversation. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you so much, Anna. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about my work a little bit to you and to Alex. I mean, this is an incredibly rich forum to be able to share work. I have old colleagues and friends who are literally all over the world now, from New Zealand to Europe to the US. So it's an uncommon opportunity, and I really appreciate it. So I think what I want to do in order to get started, I just want to say a little bit about how I came to this project, because I think it's illustrative of, well, a couple of things, but particularly about the way that at least I try to work as a historian. So in the midst of doing the Domingos Álvares project, which you just mentioned, there was a section or a part of that book that focused on Pernambuco. And as I was going through the documentation for colonial Pernambuco, I was looking through a series of cases where European ships were coming to the northeast of Brazil. And I was just going through them to try to sort of build context. And one of those cases happened to be the case of the Black Prince. At the time, it was just, for me, an obscure sort of case. But it also stood apart because it was a slave ship, it was a British slave ship that arrived on the northeast coast of Brazil. And it had no slaves on board. And the crew members, they had a story in which they claimed that the ship had been blown off course in a storm. But what happened while the crew was in Brazil was quite striking, because they were clearly at odds with one another. There were two different factions. One faction was on shore, and there was a fight on shore in Fortaleza. And the British captain of the ship did not want to sanction or punish the man who started the fight against him. So the Portuguese intervened and sent him back to the ship. And then this guy, with his henchmen, they commandeer the ship, cut the line, and fire cannon shot into Brazil and take off into the Caribbean, leaving behind nearly a dozen men. And so, I read this while I was writing Domingos Álvares, and I thought, well, this is interesting, but it has nothing to do with Africa or enslaved people. And I really wasn't that interested in it. But as is at least my want as a historian, I find these little like nuggets or fragments that seem interesting to me. When I finished with Domingos, I came back to that case and I started reading it. I mean, initially I read it very quickly, very tersely. But then when I came back to it and started digging into it a little bit further, it seemed there was something else going on there that I didn't have the answers to. So then I started digging around. I mean, fortunately, this project came about in the digital age when it's a lot easier to do this kind of work than it has been in any of my previous projects. Everything prior to this was done like going to the archives and sitting in there. And I ended up doing some of that with this, but so much of this was catapulted by the fact that I could literally go online and, for example, in this case, look in British newspapers just using search terms. You got to be creative still as a historian. You got to know what terms to use, obviously, but and I was very quickly able to sort of patch together this story on the British side, which really shone a different kind of light on what was happening. And as it turns out, now I'll tell the story that I try to tell here in the book. What happened was the ship Black Prince left Bristol in late 1768 in December. And the sort of background, I in the early part of the book, I provide sort of a contextual background for the sort of urban setting and demographics of what the heck just happened? Did I get cut off? Jack,
You're good on our end. You're still
good?
coming through just fine.
Sorry, I don't know what happened to me. Sorry. My screen just went blank all of a sudden. The first chapter sort of sets it's a setting, a contextual setting for Bristol in the middle of the 18th century. And what I try to do there is to provide particularly an optic on the working classes and particularly on sailors. And 1768 is a really crucial year, at least in the history of Bristol, because there's an economic depression going on. There's a famine that happened over the winter. The winter was a very long and quite harsh winter. And then in the summer of 1768, sailors starting in Sunderland, but then spreading throughout the British Isles, go on strike for the first time. They demand higher wages. I mean, the whole idea of the strike actually comes from striking the sails, and that idea itself, the very word strike, according to every evidence that we have, was born during this strike, the series of strikes that happened in 1768. So the timing of this is quite important in terms of telling the story I want to tell about the Black Prince, because then the Black Prince subsequently leaves from Bristol in December of 1768. So the sailors who are on board are already primed and they have sort of this background of, if you want to call it, militancy, but then also having suffered through the difficulties of 1767 and 1768. So the ship leaves from Bristol. Its first destination is Calabar on the West African coast. But before the ship ever arrives in Calabar, the crew mutinies. They take the captain and the officers on the ship, they put them in the longboat of the ship, and they set them out to sea to die. Then they proceed to elect new officers. They rechristen the ship Liberty. They change the name from Black Prince to Liberty. And they vote to strike out for Brazil. So they're about 1,000 miles off the coast of Africa. They send the crew to die, and then they take off for Brazil. Now, at this juncture, everything seems like, revolutionary history. And look, as I was reading this, I thought initially I was going to be telling a story primarily about the crew members on board and about this, what this mutiny actually wrought in terms of the sort of revolutionary Atlantic, kind of vis-a-vis the arguments of Marcus Rediker and others. But what I quickly discovered was that as soon as this mutiny was over with and the democratic process, if you will, had begun to unfold, the sailors on board the ship started turning on each other almost immediately. In fact, the man who was primarily responsible for fomenting the rebellion was not elected to become the captain of the ship. Rather, another man who was a little more temperate was elected to become captain, and that set off a series of resentments and disgruntlement where two different factions formed around each of these men. So that by the time they arrived in Brazil, they were already at odds with one another. There were fights on board the ship. There were arguments. So when they got to Fortaleza, and they were trying to they pretended like they were the old captain and crew because they had to provide the original papers for the ship to Portuguese authorities. So, for example, the man who was the captain at the time was posing as using the name of the captain who they'd sent off to die. But while they were on shore, these two came to blows with one another. And I think I mentioned this earlier. The man who was trying to commandeer the ship was eventually sent back. He was put in chains and then sent back to the ship while it was sitting in the bay. The ship was being provisioned primarily by Native American laborers. This is another part of the story that I won't get into in any depth, but I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. Basically corvée laborers who were in the employ of the Portuguese authorities, Native Americans who were putting water and wood on board the ship, on the understanding from the Portuguese side that this was just a slave ship that had been blown off course, and they were sort of extending the normal diplomatic courtesies to this British crew. So this man, Thomas Austin, gets on board the ship. He cuts the line, he commandeers, and he takes it into the Caribbean, and he leaves behind 11 people. So there are 11 Brits who are still left in the northeast of Brazil. He takes the ship while he's maneuvering through the Caribbean. There are a number of different conflicts that take place. He thinks that the cook of the ship is trying to undermine his authority, so he calls for a trial on board the ship, which he presides over. And the cook is convicted of trying to hijack the ship. He's hung from the forward mast and killed. Eventually, the ship ends up in Vieques. In those days, they called it Crab Island. But while in Vieques, a number of other sailors on board the ship abandoned the ship. By the time it was moving along, it eventually shipwrecks on the southern coast of Hispaniola. Right on the border of what today is the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And when it does so, by that time, there are only a little over a dozen crew members who are left on the ship. And they scatter. They scatter all over the Atlantic world. And it's at that juncture that you start to see, and this is where the story sort of shifts. I shift the story toward the owners of the ship, who begin a process that extends from basically the middle of 1769 all the way until 1777, where they are very zealously trying to round up each of these figures who took part in the mutiny. And what I chronicle over the course of the second third of the book is their efforts to try to round up these individuals. And what's remarkable is how effective they actually are at it. I mean, everything from surveillance to policing to controlling the judiciary, and even at the very end of the process, basically commandeering the foreign policy of the Portuguese, for example, in order to try to bring justice to those men who are in Brazil, but then are eventually they eventually arrive in Lisbon, and it's in Lisbon where those men are actually tried and convicted. So, but in addition to those five, there was one who was picked up in Suriname. There were two who were picked up in Boston. There was one who was picked up in Saint-Domingue, one who was picked up in London, another who was picked up in West Africa. So they're literally picked up by these owners and brought back to London to be tried and hung. Finally, the last third of the book I spend looking at the owners themselves, who it turns out are really, I think, iconic sort of figures in the slave trade in Bristol in the 18th century. The two co-owners, one of them is a man named James LaRoche Jr., He was the nephew of the largest slave trader in Bristol in the 18th century. And basically, he inherited his uncle's business, but he was not a very good businessman himself. In fact, as his uncle was retiring, he sold the ship to John Fowler, who was the primary owner of the ship, and James LaRoche Jr. was the secondary owner of the ship. So Fowler was the second largest slave trader in Bristol in the 18th century. And between the two of them, LaRoche Jr. eventually became a member of Parliament. He had all kinds of connections. He was a pretty useless businessman and not someone with what I would consider a very high intellect. He wasn't very accomplished on his own terms, but he had great connections and he inherited a lot of money and property. By the time he died, he had squandered every penny he had. Much of it actually in attempting to make money in the slave trade. He was a very poor businessman. Fowler, on the other hand, had actually worked his way up from being a shipboard worker to being an officer to being a captain on board a ship, and eventually became a merchant king. By the time Fowler died, he was worth roughly the equivalent in today's dollars of about $20 million. And he left each of his 6 children, what we would say today, as millionaires. And what I do over the last parts of the book is try to trace the next 2 generations of the Fowler family. And what's remarkable is the way in which, I mean, you know, there have been many people who've written about the impacts of the slave trade on England's wealth, and you know, there's lots of debates about reparations. I took a subtly different angle. I mean, the money is there, but following the money also really opens up onto the sort of social and political world that was driven, I think, in large part by the slave trade. So, for example, Fowler's children went into business. None of his children or grandchildren ever engaged in the slave trade. His sons did inherit properties that he owned in the West Indies and were the beneficiaries of that. One of the properties in Jamaica, for example, went into arrears after Fowler died, and they collected the sugar from those plantations as payment for, you know, in future years. But each of his children also like magnified and grew the wealth that they had inherited from him. The 2 brothers traded in mahogany in the Americas. He had a grandson who actually prospected in Colombia, was trading in gold, trading in British goods, and then trading gold back to England. He had another grandson who became an Anglican priest. He had another grandson who invested in early railroads in England. And Fowler himself diversified his slave trading business into, by the time he died, his major holdings were in a bank that he was a part owner of, in government bonds. So he invested in government bonds, in a gunpowder manufacturing that he invested in. But he was quite diverse in terms of his holdings. So I try to do some of the forensics of the finances on the Fowler side. So that's sort of the arc of the book. The big argument is that that this kind of corporate state capture, I mean, it's funny, when I was writing this, the idea of corporate state capture wasn't nearly as salient as it has become in the last 3 or 4 months. But it's sort of caught up. And I think for me, what was striking are the ways in which people like Fowler and LaRoche were not just the ways that they were able to build their wealth, but the ways that they were able to capture mechanisms of governance in the judiciary and the diplomacy. In the case of Portugal, for example, they insisted that the Black Prince mutineers who were in Lisbon be sent back to England for trial. The Portuguese refused, but after years of diplomatic sort of going back and forth, they capitulated and agreed to have a British judge judge them in Lisbon. So there was a judge conservator who worked, and I go into some detail on the ways in which the consulate and British merchants in Lisbon were actually manipulating, controlling many of the mechanisms of not just diplomacy, but particularly mercantile trade. So I think one of the things I'm trying to emphasize here are the ways in which the slave trade had tentacles that went into a variety of different governance structures, judiciary, diplomacy, but then also like practices that we've come to think of as sort of normalized, like life insurance policies, for example. I spent some time talking about life insurance in the slave trade. So that's the basic thrust. I think I've talked for more than 15 minutes, so I'll shut up now and I'll take whatever questions you all have.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you so much. So we can now start then the Q&A, and you are free then to raise your hands. And if you want, you can also use the chat. But we would prefer if you want to ask your questions directly, if you can. Okay, let's see who will be the first. And let me see, what do you have here? Okay, I will let Tatiana, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Jim, for sharing your book with us. I very much look forward to reading it. It's in the mail. But I was looking at your table of contents. I'm finishing up a book right now, and I think a lot about what goes into a book. So you've obviously spent a lot of time building up your narrative, right? Having an arch in which there's a story that follows different individuals. And even in your rendering, I can already see it. I can already imagine some of these people. But I see that you also have 21 black and white illustrations. And I wondered if you had used historical maps, and if so, what were the questions that you went into when you were examining these historical maps? As we all try to expand our evidentiary basis, we all look at account books and letters and everything else, but I myself have been really trying to lean into other kinds of sources. So I wondered if you could share your experiences with that.
No, that's a terrific question. Thank you, Tatiana. I'm trying to, as you asked the question, I was trying to Rolodex in my head the images. I think I only have one historical map, but it's crucial. And why? Because well, as many of you probably know, whenever you're writing a book and you're trying to sort of figure out details, there are often these mysteries that you're trying to solve, or at least in my case, that's, it's like, all right. One of the mysteries for me initially was when sort of after what I'm calling the counter-revolution. Yes, Alex, that's it. That's exactly right. Is that the only one? I think it is. So
I think so.
After what I'm calling the counter-revolution, in other words, when Thomas Austin commandeers the ship in Brazil and then takes it into the Caribbean, there are very terse descriptions of where the ship actually wrecks. And there are two different descriptions that I saw. One was Cape Mongo, and the other one was Petit Trot. And I couldn't find any of these on contemporary maps, so I ended up having to go to the historical maps. And it's for that very, I mean, they're very clearly delineated on that historical map that Alex just held up. So I felt compelled to actually use that as in some ways, as at least the 18th century verification that, yeah, that's the place. Because there was another place called, I don't think it's Petit Trot, it's something else Trot that's on the northern coast of Hispaniola. So I was sort of toggling between those until I discovered this map, and it actually helped quite a bit.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tatiana. And now we have Adriana. Adriana, I will add you to, and
Hi.
you can go ahead.
So two methodological questions, Jim. I enjoyed the presentation. I look forward to reading as well, myself. So the first question is, you give us the story of the mutiny, and I just wonder if you had started with a document that wasn't about the mutiny, it would have been a book about a boat involved in the slave trade. You could have probably learned the same lessons about the corporate state capture in some ways. So I wonder what this particular story, the story of the mutiny, how that changes the conclusions, if at all, right? Is it, does it change the story, or is it just, you're following the document's lead to construct the story in a way, to construct the argument? And the second question is, I'm thinking about, how we write books after the first book, right? I finished my first book and I'm going through the difficulties of conceiving a second book. And, the first book was also about relations between the state. It was about the relation between an individual and the state, right? And it was a subaltern history, right? And now you're telling us the same story, but from a supraaltern, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I guess my question, when you do that subaltern unearthing, there's something unexpected that comes up. And I wonder what is unexpected here in your finding that there is corporate state capture. Right? What is your intervention in that particular argument? Because that is an argument that other scholars have made.
Sure. Okay, so two things. First, I think in answering your first question, you're absolutely right that and anyone who knows Domingos, it's funny in some ways. This is like the inside out of Domingos Álvares, right? I mean, it's this, as you say, it's the people who are sort of on top of this project rather than those who are coming from below. For me, what was striking was just following the evidentiary trail. You're absolutely right that, by starting with this particular set of documents there was a mystery to be unspooled in terms of what was actually going on in Brazil with these conflicting groups of Brits, right? So, but once I got through that portion, I think what was surprising was the extent to which this individual ship represented the very apex of the Bristol slave trade. The one thing I didn't say is in the epilogue, I come back to, or I look at a more contemporary sort of version of what goes on in Bristol. And of course, anyone who's in the audience will know that the sort of Edward Colston story is the one that gets the most preeminence. But the challenge I would throw out is, okay, so, before this book, who was the largest slave trader in Bristol? No one would know the answer to that. They would immediately retreat to Colston, who, by the way, never sponsored an individual voyage from Bristol in his life. So then the question becomes, if Bristol is the starting point for this slave trade that is supposedly so monumental and transformative for Britain, particularly in its place in the world, then who were these guys and why don't we know them? So I think it's a really worthwhile story to tell. And the story about state capture, just to follow up, I think what I try to do is put a little bit more of a forensic lens onto what state capture is. I think for most people, state capture immediately goes to the crown and looks at the way that the crown is manipulating or is being manipulated by particular merchants. But I'm more interested in actually the everyday events that are happening. In other words, by following the way that these merchants try to pursue, surveil, arrest, and execute each of the individuals, the 45 individuals who are on board this ship, as I follow them and trace that stuff, there's something chilling about that I don't think exists in some of the earlier literature. But I could be wrong because I can't look. The other thing the caveat here, because this is so sprawling, I do find myself stepping outside of my comfort zone to a certain extent, particularly when I get into the British Atlantic world. It's a much more robust literature. I've tried my best to sort of cover my bases. But I withhold the possibility that I could have a few errors, or not errors, but cracks in my own sort of reading. But I don't know of nothing I've seen sort of gets into that kind of detail.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Adriana. And you have Miranda now. Miranda, I will let you go. Go ahead.
Jim. It's Sunday morning here.
So
I'm coming from the future. Not being an Atlantic world historian, I've got more sort of a cheeky question, I guess, which is I think building on Adriana's question about the shift from kind of subaltern agency to a depiction or in a characterization of power dominance. And I wondered if you might reflect a bit more on how that might, I know your dislike of presentism, but how that might reflect on not only changing scholarly concerns, I guess it's changing political concerns in the contemporary world on the one hand, but also sort of a question of the historian aging and the kinds of questions that we begin to ask, because I feel like as younger historians, we are often interested in sort of activist, well, many of us get kind of compelled by a kind of story of activist change, but as we get older, we get a bit more, I don't know, cynical, but a bit more complex in our approach to those questions. So I was wondering if you could just reflect on those.
Yeah. I know what you're saying, and actually, it would be only you who would provoke me in this way. So I will take the bait and I will run with it. So let me talk about this by way of some of the characters in the book, because I think that's the easiest thing for me. So you're absolutely right that but I mean, you're right and you're wrong. I mean, look, when I wrote about Domingos Álvares, it's funny because I tried to write about him as a very full figure. I mean, he was not, people read that book as though he's this sort of salutary hero, but there were many, many moments in that book where, I mean, and I've said it, he's a jerk and he's abusing people in his community, if you will, right? So I see a lot more ambiguity even in the earlier work. But when in this one, I do confess that you're right. As you age, you become more conscious of sort of these ambiguities and the uncertainty. So, I mean, I'll use even John Fowler as an example, right? I mean, by one definition, Fowler is sort of the epitome of the evil guy, right? The bad guy. He's the slave merchant, the second largest slave trader. He traded, tens of thousands of Africans. But if that's the sole story, if that's his entire life story, just that sort of bullet point, it misses the fact that he came from a very humble place and worked himself literally, from the bottom up. He worked on board a ship, then he became an officer, then he became a captain, and he ran that gauntlet, which was a gauntlet of death for many people. And then he reached this sort of platform. Meanwhile, his partner, who was born into privilege and money, squandered it all during his lifetime. And so what I try to do in the book is sort of juxtapose these sort of different trajectories. And I think that's more historically real and human and accurate. I mean, none of us are saints and none of us are sinners completely, right? I mean, and I think that's kind of where I want to end up here. The other thing that I haven't said it's a question I should have, it's not come yet, but I anticipate it. There's an entire chapter in the book on Calabar, which it deals with several different layers of, if you will, both sort of people who are becoming enslaved and if you will, enslaved victimhood. I mean, the people are being taken to the Americas against their will, but at the same time, there are merchants in Calabar who are making incredible wealth off of the slave trade, and some of them were themselves slaves at one point in their lives and then become merchant kings. So, tracing those trajectories and sort of demonstrating the ways that people can move over the course of their lifetimes is an important part of the historian's writ, if you ask me. And to sort of pigeonhole people into a singular identity, I just think it's ahistorical. And I think I've said that in other venues too. It gets me in trouble for saying it these days, but that's just to me and I try to see those ambiguities. There's another really interesting case that I bring up in the book that happens at roughly the same time of a group of African slaves they're called Egbo who they work as mercenaries on behalf of slave traders in West Africa, basically going and raiding villages and sending slaves into the slave trade. But when their utility dries up and they're no longer politically useful, they get put on the ships as well. And when they do, they're put on the ships to work as soldiers on board the ships. And I chronicle the history of this one British slave ship on which a French privateer tries to take the ship. And the ship is saved entirely by these Egbo Marines, as the captain of the ship called them. And the ship was saved only so they could then end up in Jamaica themselves as slaves. It's this wildly crazy, deeply disturbing story. I mean, the only silver lining to this for me is that they arrive into Jamaica at almost the exact same time as Tacky's rebellion is unfolding. So I at least make the suggestion that perhaps as trained soldiers, they found themselves sort of thrust into a different sort of Atlantic war, right? So, I mean, but these are important questions to sort of grapple with to change over time. So.
Thank you. Have Alex. Thank you, Miranda.
Yeah, thank you, Miriam. Actually, I raised my hand to ask you a question about the butchery right before you started talking about them. Because of the whole book, that episode captured for me what I think is your second thesis. Because I know that you're leaning into the state capture, corporate capture of the state. It's great because that one speaks to the overall arch. But the first half of the book is mostly the story you're tracing is a story of class not being able to hold as the heuristic for allegiances. How class breaks down in the face of individual interests, of small group interests. The whole Black Prince thing is about small group interests fighting against each other and overturning grander ideals of democracy, right? That we might want to believe in the democracy of the Buccaneers and kind of stuff like that, but it breaks down when we look at this example. But and then the Gvashari example is a great one of how a great example of how our imagination of like, wait, these people are supposed to be playing the role of slaves, but they're the ones who are defeating the French. On the top of the ship because the white guys went to the bottom to do the cannons while they stayed on the top, right?
Yeah.
So it kind of undermines kind of like our preconceptions about this. But you don't lean into that as a thesis, maybe because perhaps other people have suggested this before as part of, we can feel it in the air as the song goes.
Mm-hmm.
But my question is simple, which is, fine, we won't lean into it as the prime thesis, but is there a way to connect that to the one that you are arguing is the main thesis of the book? Is there a way to connect the role that this individual pursuit and the breaking away from class consciousness from is perhaps one of the motivating or driving forces of the corporate? I don't know. It's loosely connecting in my head, but maybe you have thought about this deeper, and that's why I'm
asking. No, it's a great question. Yeah. So my view of this, I'll answer the question in two ways. One is to say, I think that, I think I make the argument in the book that I see the Ecboshere as being caught up in this larger web of corporate state capture. In other words, they are mercenaries on behalf of African slave traders who are then funneling slaves for the British to the coast, and then they're taken to the Caribbean, right? So they are themselves without even, but and the sort of corollary to this is that they are clientelist. In other words, they have patrons who they are dependent on, and they are the ones who give them their status, right? They're attached to people who have status. And even the irony is, even on the slave ship, right? They're armed, so they're different than those who are below decks. They're given a privileged place. The shocking part is that then when they arrive in Jamaica, the rug is pulled out from under them, right? I mean, that's the part that's like completely vexing and even baffling to me. I don't like over time, I guess like communication, there's no way they would know, right? They're duped. And that's to me the real tragedy of the Ecboshere, at least, is that they're doing all of this work, imagining that there are sort of reciprocal obligations on the part of the captain of the ship, for example. I mean, they saved the damn ship, right? Otherwise, it's gone. But then they arrive in Jamaica and they immediately become slaves. So it's a bitter, bitter, bitter irony. But to come back, yes, I mean, I do think that like there are two different answers. One is that all of these anomalous stories are caught up in what I think is a much larger system. The other part, you're right, the first half of the book sort of traces this fracturing, if you will, of what oftentimes I think is presented as a unified working class, particularly among sailors. It's just not true in the slave trade. These guys are just at each other's throats very, very quickly. And the consequences of that are real. They're also replicating they're aiming to be basically sort of their own kinds of merchant kings. They're replicating many of the structures and ideas that their merchant masters and their captains are articulating. And they're just not
like the temporarily impoverished millionaires of American society in 2025, exactly. Right? Like
yes, exactly.
The temporary setback.
Yeah. So anyway, I see more questions. Thanks, Alex. That's a good question.
Okay. Thank you, Jim. Alex, okay, let me see. Okay, go ahead, please. Isaac, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Good to see you, Jim.
Yeah.
Thanks for this opportunity. I have a question about, I guess, genre, and kind of the genre this book fits in a little bit. There's you know a there's a handful of books about ships in the slave trade. There's the Diligent, the Hare, and now we have the Black Prince now. And I guess I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about to what extent you saw yourself as you were putting the book together as kind of writing in that genre, and now kind of having, and yours is, I think, of course, a very unique, and it's not like it's similar and different in different ways, but I guess now having written a book that is about a slave ship, what you think about kind of what those kinds of books do and don't do, I guess, as studies of slavery writ large.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the simple answer to your first question is I never wanted to see it as fitting in the genre of histories about slave ships. And the reason for that is because I do feel like there are limitations to that, right? And I think I was very conscious as I was pursuing the project that I didn't want the story to be about the ship per se. And it really, at the end of the day, it's not. Rather, what it is focused on are the different personalities and people who are on board the ship. And at that juncture, at times the book becomes unwieldy because there's so many characters, and it's like which story deserves place of prominence versus another one. What ends up happening is that the ship becomes the vehicle for telling these other stories. I think my editor was probably a little frustrated that there wasn't more of the story about the mutiny and about the ship, because that seems to be like, I think that particularly for non-scholarly readers, the story of a pirate ship is a lot more sexy, for example, than the story of like slave traders and their individual stories, or the stories of the workers on board the ship, or the Africans who were involved in the trade. So what I try to do is build a slave trade story around the ship. And I think, I mean, at the end of it, I'm still a storyteller. I wanted to tell a good story, and as I sort of waded my way through the documentary evidence, I just chased the stories that were the most interesting and provocative and curious to me, and ones that I thought would shine new light on the way that we understand certain aspects of the trade, whether it was the merchants or the workers on board the ships, who I think have been, romanticized to a certain extent. Whether it's the African merchants, who are oftentimes not really dealt with in any detail or any, complex sort of explanatory ways. So I'm just trying to, it's pointillist though. Like at the end of the day, much like, when people would ask me about Domingos Álvares, they're like, okay, well, this is an exceptional case. What does it say about the whole? Well, I think telling exceptional cases can tell us a lot about the whole. Especially we know a little bit about that larger context. It can provoke new questions about the things we thought we already knew.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Isaac.
Thanks,
And thank
Jim.
you, Jim.
Yeah.
We have a question coming from the chat, and it is, I don't know if you want to ask the question directly. Okay, go ahead, please.
Thank you so
Here
much.
she is.
Okay.
Are you hearing me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I couldn't read already. I just want to obtain the book and to read very carefully, because I'm very interested in this period. And I was wondering what was the place of the companies, the royal companies, the monopolist companies created by Pombal, just the Companhia do Comércio de Pernambuco e da Paraíba, because in this moment they were actuating very strongly in this region, in all Aracati, Recife, on all the ports of the Northwest. So this one thing. Another, it's about if you think that we can join to this conversation in your narrative, the fact that in this moment, Portugal prohibited the slave trade in the metropolis So it's a kind of, kind of brecha, and there was a changing the patterns of the slave trade as a whole. So this conjuncture was very specific, I think. So you kept a very good story, and it illuminates the whole picture, we can say. But there is a kind of, moment of different, actors that could be in the stage. That's it.
So let me say a little bit about what actually happens in Brazil and in Portugal. It's kind of a fascinating story. The major dispute that emerges between the British and the Portuguese over these would end up being 4 men. What happens is there are a number of men who are left behind in Fortaleza. There are 5 men who board a ship in Recife, and they go to Lisbon. And they go there, they spend nearly a year in Brazil on the understanding that they had actually been victims of a mutiny. In other words, so the Thomas Austin cuts the line and shoots into a Fortaleza and takes off. So they assume that they are victims, right? And so they feed them and clothe them and then send them to Lisbon, from whence they were going to then go back to England. But as soon as they arrive in Lisbon, one of the mutineers goes to the British consul and denounces his shipmates, his comrades. So the consul goes to the Secretary of State and says, arrest these guys. So they're put in jail. The four of them are put in jail. One of them is off because he gave the testimony. They sit in jail for 3 years. And during this time, there's this back and forth where the merchants in England are actually trying to shape. First, they want them extradited to London to be tried in London by the Admiralty. Then they argue that if they will not be extradited, then they should be tried by a judge conservator, a British judge conservator in Lisbon. And basically, there's this back and forth between the Portuguese government and the British government, and it all centers around merchant rights in Lisbon, right? The Portuguese are bristling under what have been, 150 years of unfair treaty rights between England and Portugal. And they don't want to give an inch. And the Portuguese king and Pombal are they're writing to London and saying, this is a common crime. We should be able to try these people in the royal courts here. Why do you want them extradited? There's also, to your point, the companies, as far as I can tell, there's no real role of the companies except for the fact that there are obviously people in the higher levels of government who themselves, Melo Castro and others, who have actually been in Brazil, so they're aware. They and that comes through. So what they do is they try to shape the narrative in a way that it first presents the British sailors as having committed crimes against Brazil. In other words, they're conflating these guys with the ones who ran off with the ship. But eventually they give way and they say, okay, fine, you can try. But this is all this is diplomatic chess. Meanwhile, these guys are in jail. They're not being tried. They're not being questioned. They're complaining. Interestingly, too, the British merchant house in Lisbon winds up paying they're paying for their upkeep while they're in jail for 3 years. In other words, they're paying for their food, they're paying for their water, their clothing, and those kinds of things. They then appeal to the Naval Board of Britain to repay them. So the merchants actually wind up getting recompensed from the British Navy in order for these guys while they're in jail in Lisbon, right? And they pay for their trial as well. They end up, 4 of them, 2 of them are acquitted. This is the other thing. 2 of them are acquitted in Lisbon. 2 of them are they're arrested and convicted of sentenced to galley labor. One of them is released in 1777 when the Queen comes to power. She releases a number of prisoners. Diplomatic prisoners, though, not criminals, which is really interesting. Portugal sees these as diplomatic prisoners, not criminals, which is very fascinating. And then finally, one of them remains in jail for the rest of his life. The guy who was the captain of the ship after the initial mutiny. So yeah, I mean, the story is more one that is between Lisbon and London than it is between Brazil and Lisbon or Brazil and London. So it ends up being a diplomatic dispute. But the companies loom large there, I would say, particularly because of Pombal and because of Meli Castro.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Liris. Yes, you have Philip. Then let me just add Philip. Go
Thank you.
ahead,
Hi,
please.
Jim. I wanted to ask a bit about the crew members themselves and their backgrounds. You said they scattered to Suriname and to the US and to West Africa. Are they all from Bristol or from the UK, or they, if they're not, then how did their backgrounds shape what they did in the mutiny and then in Brazil and then their subsequent, attempts to get out of prison and so on?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I think there are different layers to answering your question. The first instance I can answer by simply saying, I mean, we have a muster roll of everybody who was on board the ship. It was, as I say in the book, a sort of a stereotypical motley crew. They came from everywhere. They were Irish, they were Scotch, they were Danish. There was a mulatto young man. There was even an African guy from Annobon, off the coast of Gabon, who had joined in the service of the British slave trade and was working on board the ship. I spend some time talking about him. He takes on the name Philip. He takes on the name Philip Thompson. Felipe Antonio dos Santos was the name that he was given it, when he was baptized in Annobon, and that's the name that he gave to the Portuguese when they arrived in Brazil. And this is an African guy. He's the only African guy on board the ship. He serves as the translator for the ship while they're in Brazil. His Portuguese is sketchy. I mean, the Portuguese, if you will, of Annobon is actually, the language is Fadambu, which is not, it's only recently been put into script, right? So it's an oral language. And there's Portuguese vocabulary there, but it's not mutually understandable. So basically, he was sort of walking his comrades through the translations, but he did well enough to be able to negotiate trade with the Portuguese and to be able to explain, at least in brief, what was going on. So he's a key figure I talk about. The others. So one of the guy who ends up in Suriname is a Dane. The majority of them who flee, they go back into working on ships. So nearly all of them wind up being captured, the ones who are captured, either on board, like the one who's captured in Africa is captured on board a slave ship in what today's present-day Liberia. Another one is captured working on a ship in Martha's Vineyard. Another one is captured working on ships that were running between the northern part of Haiti and New England, Newburyport to be precise. And what's even more, again, like one of the things that's striking about the story to me is the extent to which surveillance of these different figures, regardless of where they were from, was so pervasive. The newspapers at the time, as rudimentary as they were, and as long as it took news to spread, they were relentless up and down the East Coast, in the Caribbean, basically advertising sightings of these individuals. And some of them are, of course, they're inaccurate. They get their names wrong. They get the description, but some of them are very, very detailed. In the case of the man who was captured in Suriname, John Scholes was his name. He was a Dane, and they described his down to the color of the shirt that he's wearing and the pants that it's a very detailed description that's issued by the governor of Massachusetts in the first instance, because he was first seen, or there were eyewitnesses who claimed they saw him in Massachusetts, but then he's eventually captured in Suriname, brought back to Boston, and then from Boston taken to London and eventually hanged. So I don't know does that answer your question? I mean, it's like I say, it's a motley crew. I mean, there's no simple answer. They range in age from younger boys, like 8, 10 years old, all the way up to men in their 50s. Like I say, there are 2 men of color on board the ship that I can tell for certain. They're Danes, they're Irish, they're English, but they're not. They're based out of Bristol, it seems, many of them, although not all of them. There's another man named George Geary who traveled to Bristol just shortly before the ship left. He was from Hastings, and so they're really scattered from all about.
Thanks, Jim. I got to run actually, so nice to see you, and thanks to all of you.
Yep, take care.
Thank you, Philip. Okay, let's see if you have more questions. If not, I will jump. Then let me just see. Okay. I have, Jim, in the beginning of the first chapter, you have then a sentence in which you say that the vast majority of the slave traders, roughly 80%, descended from families at the margins of society. These were the sons of servants, farmers, sailors, and tradesmen. And I would like you to discuss a little bit more about the background of these that are the slave traders, assuming that these are people that are not the crew members, but the ship captains and the ship owners. And I asked myself about how Bristol differ from other slave trading ports in the UK and perhaps even in other places in Europe, because in the case of Liverpool, then of course Bristol, we know then one of the examples that is the most prominent is the case of Colston, which is an earlier case, but in Liverpool, for example, we know that the mayors of Liverpool were nearly all of them involved with the Atlantic slave trade. The same, I take the example of one place that I studied, that is La Rochelle, and we had then these slave traders, one of them who came then from these rich families and who became also the mayor of La Rochelle. Then I would like you just to tell us a little bit more about the slave traders, the ship owners, and the ship captains themselves, because we know that also these connections with the families and the entire cities were based on that. And then regarding the memorialization, which is something that you touch then towards then at the epilogue, that you point out to that. And of course, that in Bristol is Colston is Colston City, and used to be until 2020, then Colston everywhere. But we do not have necessarily much about these other individuals who were involved in the Atlantic slave trade, and there were many who were. Then I ask myself whether you see the case of the Black Prince being incorporated to this process, or if there are any interesting things that you found in Bristol that regard the people that were part of the crew and the owners of the Black Prince.
Great. Now, these are good questions. Thank you. So to your first question about the sort of the complexion, the sort of class background of the traders and the merchant traders and the captains. I mean, a lot of what I'm working with there, I'm building on, like, the work of Nick Radburn, for example, whose book just came out last year, maybe a year and a half ago now, which, and he's focused largely on Liverpool, but does a really fine job, I think, quantitatively, of showing how ship captains, many of them entered into the slave trade as, it was a risky business, and it required not just the willingness to be able to go broke, but also the sort of stamina, the physical stamina, and the willingness to put one's life at risk, oftentimes, in order to engage in the trade. So there's two different questions here. One is about captains, one is about merchants. I mean, in the case of someone like Fowler literally worked his way up, right, from the bottom up to the merchant class. many merchants were like small farmers, small traders. They had some capital going in, but they were risking quite a lot in order to be able to enter into the trade as merchants. In Fowler's case, he had built his sort of foundation entering in as a merchant, as a slave trader, as a captain on board a ship. So there are different sort of avenues, but basically it was like yeoman farmers, people who'd worked themselves in the slave trade. One of the things I find, and this is kind of a segue to your second question, one of the things I find in the case, I do think it's important to distinguish between Bristol and Liverpool, though, too, because I think Bristol epitomizes the sort of high, if you will, the high capitalist point of the slave trade in Britain. And what I mean by that is to say that the trade itself had become a lot more economically streamlined and defined, I think, by the time Liverpool takes over. And to be fair, the story I'm telling is really at that pivotal point. In other words, Bristol had controlled the slave trade up until about the middle of the 18th century, and this inflection point, particularly in Calabar, after the Calabar massacre in 1767, Liverpool just completely takes over that market. And to a large extent, that is about the connections between Liverpool merchants and Calabar merchants and the sort of relationships that they built up over the course of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Whereas in Bristol's sort of high point or apex in terms of their involvement in the slave trade was really during the Royal Africa Company period, right? So that does create a very distinct sort of trajectory. And I think it also speaks to why Colston has such place of prominence in the story about Bristol. But like I say, I mean, I've got two sort of bones to pick with those who concentrate primarily on Colston. One is that the majority of Colston's wealth came from his work with the RAC, and he was in London at the time. So the Bristol story doesn't really, like, Colston never sponsored slave voyages as an individual. He was an officer in the Royal Africa Company and did a lot of dirty dealings with that. He was a money lender. He traded in all kinds of things, right? But what that does is it obscures these other guys who were very much involved. And to your question, the argument I make in the book is that people like Fowler had like these webs that they created in the city of Bristol. People who were like Fowler's father-in-law, for example, was a shipbuilder. He did sponsor one or two slave voyages, but he was primarily a shipbuilder and owned docks. And so he was intimately involved in the African traffic, but he doesn't register necessarily as a slave trader, right? And there were tons of other people like these, bankers, attorneys, people who were manufacturing goods that went to Africa. So there was a lot of vertical integration in Bristol. So I mentioned earlier that Fowler owned, in part, again, with other partners. So I'm trying to expand this out. He had partners who were involved in creating, like, manufacturing the iron manillas, right? They were traded in Calabar. He had partners in the gunpowder manufacturer that he was using the gunpowder to trade. He had partners in an alcohol distillery, so it just goes on and on. And as you sort of expand out, you start to see that it's really difficult to avoid the taint of slavery for anyone, even though there were tons of people who they did not have a direct connection. Many people are concentrating on that now, that question of, like, for me, there's an open question about what constitutes a direct connection to the slave trade. And my conclusion is that I think nearly everyone in Bristol in the 18th century was touched by the slave trade in one way or the other.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't think we have more questions. Then I will continue. I add a few more. And this is interesting because it's also a connection with Bristol here in Rhode Island and places that we have here in the United States, in which entire cities were involved with the Atlantic slave trade. I have two other questions, but making a connection with what you just said about the kind of goods and objects and currencies that were used to purchase enslaved people then in the coasts of Africa. If you could tell us a little bit more in terms of the cargo of the ship itself, then about these things that you just mentioned, then things that were used to trade in enslaved people. You mentioned alcohol, you mentioned manillas, but I don't know if there are any other specific elements here that are different from what you see perhaps in other places, and if you would have something to add regarding that. But the other question that I would have, which is important to me and is something that I remember very well from your book when I read the book Domingos Álvares, is that book, then of course you already started with that some people would say that is the biography turn, because you were focusing on one individual. But I remember very well that the book was it was a book that was very interesting to read in terms of this narrative. It was a book that we could read as we read a novel. This book here has the same, then we have a different kind of story, but it still has this, you still have this concern with the narrative. Then it's a book, for those of you who didn't read it yet, then it's a book that is accessible, it's pleasant to read, and has this narrative. And it's not necessarily a very long book, then, which makes a book that is accessible, I would say, for students, graduate students, undergraduate students. But I would like to know, how did you conceive this narrative? If you can tell us a little bit about what options you had in the beginning, if you consider other options, and how did you get here to have this kind of format?
Okay, the second question is harder than the first one, so let me answer the first one first. In terms of trade goods, there's no manifest for the ship, so I can't tell you exactly what was on board. However, when the ship wrecked in Saint-Domingue, British sailors coming from Jamaica actually found the wreck of the ship in the shallows and went and investigated, and they found that it was full of manillas, full of iron, which is not surprising because both LaRoche and Fowler had interests in iron making. Fowler, I know from Fowler's own personal paper, not his personal papers, but his letters to other traders and sort of reading between the lines of some of the other records. He had connections. He traded beads, for example, with William Davenport in Liverpool, and negotiated his bead business with Davenport, leveraging prices from him against prices that he could get, for example, in the Netherlands. So it's very clear that his network of trade partners was quite vast. He communicated with other traders in Lancaster in England. He bought most of his cloth. He would go to London to source his cloth. He would get cloth from a man named, he worked with a guy named Samuel Peach, who winds up becoming a partner of his also in his bank. But majority of the cloth that he gets, starting when he's a captain on a slave ship, a lot of the knowledge he gains is while he's working as a ship's captain around the Atlantic world. And so he builds these, there's a social capital that goes into this as well. That is something that I don't say it explicitly, but I really think it's implicit in the book, is that the knowledge that these guys build and the networks that they're able to create over time, I think are really crucial. So I'm trying to think what other trade goods, pewter, anything that's like iron or pewter or those kinds of like goods, even things that are, in Calabar, there were luxury goods that they demanded. Guns, for example, obviously, gunpowder, cannons. There are all kinds of things. But I couldn't tell you exactly what was on the Black Prince because I don't have a manifest for it. Your second question is more intriguing and more fun in some ways. I don't have an easy answer. So maybe going back to Domingos is a better way of answering your question. So the Domingos Álvares story was easier for me to write because I could use Domingos as my vehicle, right? He was one person, and I could follow him from Dahomey to Pernambuco to Rio to Lisbon to the Algarve. So he became my window onto the different worlds that he traveled through, right? And I could build context and political stories and community stories around him and the people that were important in his life. This story came to me in the first instance, as I've already mentioned, by way of a very strange encounter that happened between British sailors in Brazil. And I was curious, and then sort of trying to weave the narrative together. Once I was done, I thought the story I was going to tell was a story initially about the sailors. I actually thought it was going to look something like a Marcus Rediker kind of story, right? But closer up and on a single sort of ship.
Mm-hmm.
But then I realized these guys started killing each other pretty quickly. So it dispelled, like that story fell apart. So then I've got to retool. And then, so what I realized is once I finished, it's a complicated story because these guys wind up being picked up in so many different places: Boston, Suriname, West Africa, and then there's that group that's in Lisbon. So to be able to just tell the story of what happened to the mutineers takes up a large portion of the book. And then once I was finished with that, what I realized was what I'm trying to say to you is that the story told itself to me. I don't know if that makes sense. So as I'm following these different figures who are being arrested and taken back to London, I'm asking myself, how is it that in the 18th century, anyone, I mean, even the king, how can they find someone in Suriname and find someone in Boston and find someone I just didn't understand that. So I started having to ask myself questions. And someone asked earlier about, well, the question about, or the argument about corporate state capture is not that new. I agree with that. But the sort of fine detail that the corporate state is able to employ in the service of individual merchants just struck me as like, it was gobsmacking to me. I was stunned, actually, that they were able to systematically do this in the way that they did. So then that pushed me to look more carefully at the figures of Fowler and LaRoche. And then I was like, okay, now this is starting to make sense. So that's how I did it. But you're right. Someone asked earlier too, like, could you imagine, I think it was Adriana who asked, could this have gone in a different direction? And the answer is, of course it could have, but these are the questions that were animating me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Alex.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up to that, because I think a third thesis of the book, since I already took the liberty of creating a second one for you. The third thesis of the book is that newspapers in the 18th century not only serve the role of creating a public sphere, which is the sort of like, the common wisdom that's what newspapers are doing in the 18th century, but actually that public sphere is born with the surveillance state at the same time, or a surveillance trans-state, in your case, a transnational surveillance network tied to the slave trade, which I thought was super interesting. It drives the chapter on liberty, but it's there present in other chapters. It sounded like something I would have super leaned into in the book itself. But then, like, you go in it, but then you move. It's just like really just dominating that one chapter. But it's such a strong, third thesis. So then if there were things you left out there, theoretical, historical, that you wanted to consider, but you felt they weren't cooked enough, that maybe you want to try out with us. It's safe space here.
No. I mean, actually, so when I was writing this, I talked a lot in the early stages of writing this. That was one of the things that struck me too, Alex, was like the extent to which the newspapers across the English-speaking world, and even crossing languages, you're right. I mean, like in the Caribbean, for example, there was clearly communication where these newspapers were a part of that. It struck me that like how effective these were. And a part of it was also, of course, just being historical and reminding myself that, all right, we imagine these port cities as like really cosmopolitan and bustling and people are moving in and out and all that. But at the end of the day, they're tiny places and people know each other and they're crossing paths with one another all the time, right? So it forced me to remember that. There's this one, when Thomas Austin is arrested, he's in the employ of a ship captain who's going back and forth to Saint Domingue, and the guy's just sitting one day reading the newspaper, and he reads about this account, and he's like, "Oh, that's the guy I've hired," and it's very intimate in that way. So when I was giving early versions of papers that are related to the book. Someone said to me, "Oh, this is like the panopticon, right? Like that it's yeah." So theoretically, I can see that argument. One of the things I want to do, I mean, just generally as a historian too, is I want to be able to sort of let the story unfold. I don't necessarily want to lean heavily into any particular like theory or thesis. I mean, again, the big thesis is about sort of the way the corporate station, and frankly, the newspapers are a big part of that. In other words, how is it that the newspapers fall into the employ of we know how they fall into the employ of the crown, but then the ways in which individual merchants are able to leverage the crown to then leverage the newspapers is something that I think is a little bit new, right? And so that I think, it's implicit. I don't, yeah, you're right. Maybe people could go further with it, but I'm just, again, I think I said this earlier, all of these sort of anomalous stories. I mean, you could build theses around a lot of them. The Egbo Sherry, the Philip Thompson. Yeah, I mean, there are different ones, but the whole point to me is like the larger story around this single voyage of a ship on which there happened to be a mutiny is kind of mind-boggling. And so I just wanted to lay it out there, and then people can draw the kinds of conclusions and go further. I mean, I love your suggestion. I do think that there's a different argument to be made about the role of the press. An insidious one. And I think as
it's being born, because it's born in the 18th century, at least in a modern form, right?
So, I mentioned this, I think Simon Newman was on here earlier. I owe this little morsel to Simon about sort of the origins of policing in London, right? I mean, this is also a piece of this story that is a very small piece. There are others who've written about the origins of policing and surveillance, but the sort of establishment of a professional police force emerges at this very same moment. And some of these mutineers wind up in London at the time when, the very first sort of like, wanted ads are appearing in newspapers and descriptions of who they are and where they were last seen. I mean, there's one wanted ad that appears in newspapers in London where they actually provide the address of one of these guys' mothers, in the newspaper to say, if you see them at this place, you can find, and that's just, you would never see that even today, right? So, it's stepping over boundaries.
18th century doxing, man. You gotta love it. Well, thank you, Jim, for everything.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Great questions, man.
Thank you, Jim. And two elements, interesting elements, because this was a question that I would ask, and I know that is not what the book is about, but it's a question that sometimes emerges in these discussions, is about women. Where are the women in the book? And then here we have one example where women could be also part of this story. And the other issue is also regarding the press, because of course that most of what you have here is then focused on Britain, and of course you have the African component as well, and the British Caribbean component. We have a little bit of Brazil, but I don't know if do we know about the repercussions of the mutiny in the Brazilian press or the French press? Because today, with what we have online in terms of these newspapers, it's something that could be interesting to see. When I did this book on Humans in Shackles, then most of what was done about the Malay revolt in Brazil, we know about, and there was also in the Brazilian press. But then there is a lot about the Malay revolt in the international press back in the time, which many people didn't find because it was not digital yet. But now that the newspapers are digitized, it's interesting that we can find those. Then this is one of the interesting possible points as well. Jim, do you want to tell us what you are planning to do next after this book, or if you have any ideas in terms of how do you how do you see this book reaching different audiences? It's a book that perhaps would have an interest, I would say, in terms of documentary film, or perhaps even even a movie. Then I don't know if you would like to tell us what you like to see this book doing from here, and also if you have plans for the future that you want to share with us.
Thank you, Anna. I have no illusions about the kind of work. I mean, I'm not even as savvy as you guys are. I don't do social media. I'm a dinosaur like that. I write my books. I enjoy the stories I tell. If someone wants to make a movie, please. I'll even let you do it for free. And it's like, I don't care.
No, don't say that. You are
Well,
recording, don't say.
He needs a manager. I want to be your
if I
manager.
say it's for free,
Like,
maybe they'll come to me. No, so I don't have anything sitting in my lap. I mean, look, I have a few pieces from. I mean, what has happened with me over my career is that I write one book and I find things while I'm writing one and it leads to the next. So when I did Recreating Africa, that's how I found Domingos. When I did Domingos, that's how I found this. When I'm doing this, I found some really interesting stuff and some of ironically, from the papers of William Davenport, Liverpool stuff, that are related to trade in Sierra Leone that I'm fascinated by, particularly the intersection of Islam and the trade. So I'm starting to mess around with some of that, and I've got there's some pretty intriguing material there that I'm trying to dig into. But otherwise, no. I mean, for the book, I think, or I hope that, kind of like Domingos and Recreating Africa, that there's a story, enough of a narrative story there that undergraduates can read it and be able to. It's accessible to them. I do see in some ways like. It's weird. I went about this sort of the backward way. I mean, I wrote the sort of subaltern, Domingos story, which is, and I know it's a much sexier and attractive story. Long before this is in some ways retrograde, right? I mean, this is like writing about slave traders, and I recognize the danger and all the, the problems with that. But what I want to do in the same way that I tried to humanize Domingos and turn him into it's an intellectual history. Ultimately, that is, it's about somebody who is imposing a different worldview onto the Atlantic and onto, sort of emerging capitalism. In this case, what I wanted to do is tell a similar kind of story, but from the other side. And I think, when you put them side by side, I think they do a lot of good work, at least in terms of the way that my own trajectory as a historian has worked and how I've tried to understand slavery and the slave trade over the years. So I'm sort of at an inflection point. I guess the other thing I've thought about doing is like maybe some kind of short synthetic kind of study of Africans in the Americas, narrowly focused in that way. In other words, nothing is bigger or ambitious as Humans in Shackles, but something much narrower, just on Africans in the Americas during the slave trade era, which has always been more interesting to me, to be fair. I mean, when I say that, I mean first generation Africans. Your question about women, which is one I do want to answer, because it's one I've anticipated. This is a story that's unfortunately, like, the protagonists are men. They're men on board ships. They're men who are merchants. But I try, I mean, throughout the book, to at least where I can bring women. For example, in the chapter on Bristol, there's there are a number of women, particularly women getting into conflicts with sailors. There's the story of John Fowler's granddaughter, first his daughter, who marries into a very, not a wealthy family. She marries a guy who's actually quite humble, but then who becomes a major banker. But he uses her money that she got from her slave trading father to build this bank, right? So, and there's an image actually of her in the book where she sat for a painting before a famous artist, right? So, I mean, it really is. I was trying to squeeze the sponge in order to be able to try to bring women into the story. So, I confess that it's not that kind. I know, I agree with you, but I tried where I could.
No, you did a good job, because yes, like the entire crew and all the actors are mainly men, but the women, they were part of this, even if they are not necessarily the protagonists.
Yeah.
So let's see if you have any more questions here. Otherwise, you are going to Okay, I don't think I am excluding anyone. So let me just then add us here like this, just to thank Jim for this great book. And for those of you who are watching this, and if you didn't read the book, the title of the book is Mutiny in the Black Prince, Slavery, Piracy, and the Limits of Liberty in the Revolutionary Atlantic World. This was published with Oxford University Press just this January 2025. And we, of course, recommend you to read the book, to assign the book. And hopefully, Jim will also be around speaking in your institutions and also invited to other gatherings like this. It was a big pleasure, Jim, to have you. And I see there is something here in the chat. Then people, I think that they are just thanking you. And I see you all. Thank you all those who attended. And we see you perhaps in the next one, which is my own book. Then I will be after you, inviting you to come. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. That was great. And thank you for the book.
No.
It was a
Thank
great
you,
read.
guys. This is terrific. I appreciate it.